Welcome to this session on deep history, interdisciplinary perspectives. I'm David Rich-Lewis, Emeritus Professor of History at Utah State University and representing the State Board of History today. I'm going to set a kind of intellectual stage for this session, and then I'll introduce the panelists. They'll give brief discussions, presentations, and then we'll turn it over, I'll try to ask some questions, and we'll turn it over to the audience. So, Thomas Andrews did a really great job today of talking about deep history in a number of different ways. And that's the theme of this year's conference. And it encourages to step back from the particularistic, especially of state history, of local history, and case studies, the methodologies that we use, and instead to consider the long history, not just of place but of region, that's informed by oral tradition, by archaeology, ethnology, ethnohistory, to natural geological processes, climate, environment, and then to look at long-term structural systems, things that persist, demographics, cultures in a plural sense, and cultural values that span generations. The point really of the organizers was to see how we could stretch the subject matter, this specific focus on Utah, beyond constricted time or space. In other words, pushing our methodological approaches in order to observe historical patterns of relationships over broader swaths of time and space. This is essentially what the Annals School, where I started my historical studies, advocated back in the 1920s and through 1950s. So I wasn't quite that old, but almost. They called it the longue durée history, the idea of eschewing our historical focus on rapid change and instead concentrating on the all but permanent elements of culture, the slowly evolving structures, focusing on ordinary people and the persistent elements of their daily lives. The idea was to examine extended periods of time in order to see larger historical trends and patterns, what anthropologists in many ways do when they talk about a synchronic approach to studying the relationship between past and present. The classic example is Fernand Braudel, Thomas introduced in his three-work masterpiece, The Mediterranean, where he deals, in the first volume, really with thousands of years of history of environmental, geographic change, and he gives equal weight to that as to peoples and places and events. But the Annals School and that longue durée approach wasn't just about breadth in time, but it was also about depth. Lucien Lefebvre, and particularly Marc Bloch, looked at the details of the world in kind of microcosmic fashion. Marc Bloch's French Rural Society, which is one of the shaping books in my historical foundation, demonstrated how much could be learned by going deep, really deep, into the mundane details of how rural agriculturalists lived their lives, the depth of specific processes, the material culture, the economies, the social conventions, but then also to do that over a long period of time, looking at those structures over generations. So the Annals School, both the kind of breadth and depth, looking for themes that reveal those interconnections among seemingly disparate events, perhaps introducing new origin stories to tell, and then looking for new historical antecedents to our contemporary practices and behaviors. So we go from that Annals School to the new social history of the 1960s, which is a direct outgrowth of it, but in many ways the promise of the sweeping synthetic histories of the Annals School descend down to the particularistic of the new social history. And the compartmentalization then that takes place in many ways in the 1960s and 70s only grudgingly giving way to those who push interdisciplinary and comparative work, especially in the recent decades, or to dialogues we're hoping to have today. So our round table of panelists have been charged with talking about some of the different ways we know, approach and study the deep history of a place or a people or a past, and to try to tease out the benefits or the limits we might talk about of such work, such approaches. And then we hope to encourage you as an audience to use this session as kind of a summation of the conference, the sessions you've seen, the stories you've heard, how it has addressed that issue of deep history or hasn't, and then what that says about our conference theme and the practice of history in Utah specifically. So our panelists, I'll introduce them quickly. Rasoul Sorkhabi has a BS and MS degrees from Jammu University in India and a PhD from Kyoto University in Japan, majoring in geology. He is a research professor of geology at the University of Utah. Also teaches geology courses at Salt Lake Community College. Rasoul is an award-winning teacher and scholar. He is widely published in the geosciences. He's interested in all things geological, but he's also interested in history, the history of science, of ideas, but also nature and literature. Thomas G. Andrews, who you've already met and heard about, professor and director of graduate studies in history at the University of Colorado Boulder, where he teaches classes in the American West, environment, indigenous peoples, and among others. He's the author of Coyote Valley, The Deep History of the High Rockies, which deals with the Utes, if you were in the session, the last session just before this, as well as the Bancroft-winning book, Killing for Coal. He's particularly interested in teaching and has a deep commitment to K through 12 teachers. This come out of the Teaching American History grants of the early 2000s. And he's interested in getting the public to think more broadly in historical terms, making sense of the present by understanding the past. His current project you heard about in the presentation today, human-animal interactions, disease in North America. And then our final presenter, should I introduce you? Yvette Tuell, who we hope will show up soon, is a member of the Shoshone-Bannock tribes. She earned her BA in Anthropology and Indian Studies at Idaho State University, a master's in environmental law from Vermont Law School, and then worked for the tribe for many years as an environmental coordinator. She returned to school at the University of Utah, and in 2019 earned her MA in history from there. Currently, she works for the Chauvin Public Affairs Division as a policy analyst for the Tribal Council. Deeply committed to public history. I was hoping she would be here to maybe talk about one of the interesting recent projects she did was organizing a historical tribal fashion show, going back using historical images of Chauvin people over time into the 20th century, their dress, and then having that on display on stage. A really fascinating public history display of past and present. So we'll start there, start with Rasoul, and go to Thomas.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me well? Okay. Thanks, David, and thank you very much for coming to our small but I hope friendly session. So I will try to be very brief so that we have time for Q&A as well. As David mentioned, I am a bit of a stranger here, and this is my first time to attend the Utah Historical Society's convention, but it's a very beautiful gathering. I'm enjoying it. I'm a geologist. My whole life has been geological, so to speak. So it's a much longer view of history. But geologists are both scientists but also historians in the sense that you try to construct or reconstruct the history of the Earth. So in that sense, we share some common ground with historians, but on a much longer view. Now, every science has contributed something to our society, to civilization. Now, in terms of geology, aside from resources, mineral resources, groundwater, etc., I think two important concepts with geology, so geoscience, I should say, including geochemistry and geophysics, geoscience has contributed to our culture. One is deep time, and the other one is a sense of dynamic Earth in the form of plate tectonics, etc. So our session is on deep history, so I will try to focus on deep time. Modern science has really changed, humankind's not only thinking but also lifestyle. And this probably started in the 16th century or so with a revolution. The first scientific revolution was in astronomy, as you know, Copernicus, Kepler, etc. And then the second one was Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. And each one of them really changed our view about the world, in the sense that the first one, Copernican revolution, proved that the Earth is not at the center of the cosmos. The sun is at all the planets are circling the sun, etc. So that was a major change. And then the Darwinian revolution, that humans have evolved, all life are interconnected, etc. But in terms of geoscience, the deep time was discovered in geology. So up until the early 19th century, I should say, almost every community, including the scientists, they only thought of in terms of thousands of years, right? They never thought about millions of years, right? So, for example, James Ussher, he was an Irish bishop. He actually calculated, based on the generations that are recorded in the Old Testament, that the earth was created like 4004 BC, etc. Right? And this was accepted. And that was a very ingenious method. I'm not trying to criticize that, but he put some numbers, but the method was not correct. So geologists started to question the history of the earth, when the earth formed, etc. And even though they have come up with this deep time, and I'm a geologist, I teach geological time scale almost on a daily basis. I think about the earth in terms of millions and billions of years, but still it is very, very hard, even for geologists, just to imagine like 2 million years, 3 million years. It's not easy, because our lifespan is 80 to 100 years. So we can imagine like a century, we can imagine the time our grandparents lived, but to think about like 1 million years, 2 million years, our brain is not really wired to, which is true, our brain is not wired to grasp this longer periods, in the evolution of the earth. And it's very natural, because nature really exists moment to moment. See what I mean? Collingwood was a British philosopher in the first half of the 20th century, and he wrote a couple of books, The Idea of History, The Idea of Nature. And when I was a student, we had to study 2 of his books. And he says that nature has no history. So history is really our product, the product of human mind, to put things in order, to put some numbers, etc. So that's why we are not wired to really grasp or imagine like 2 million years. Having said that, science has expanded our horizon, and that's a very great contribution. both psychologically, in the sense that, whenever I'm in a downtime, if I have some issues, and then I think about the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and if you squeeze that, 4.5 billion years into 1 year, it's a good exercise to do. 4.5 billion years into 1 year. So let's say the Earth was born January 1st, right? And then things have happened, lots of things happen, but very gradually. But then the dinosaurs, for example, appeared on December 1st, and then they became extinct they appeared December 14th, and 10 days later, on Christmas Day, they became extinct. Humans, if we include all kinds of, hominids that we know of, they appeared December 31st, 11 p.m., something like that. Exactly. And when we think of our civilization, agriculture, etc., it's just a second ago, right? So that gives us a very, very, I would say, psychologically relieving perspective. It puts things in perspective in the sense that we should not take some of the problems too seriously, So I guess that is one important contribution, but also that deep perspective of time kind of transferred to archaeology, to history, and Dr. Andrews, talk I enjoyed, I learned a lot about how we can now think about history as an extension of Earth history. This was not there in the 19th century or so. People thought that humans are just separate. But then we can think of geology and archaeology and history as an extension of the same process in nature. I can go on and on, but as I said, I will. It's better to keep some time for Q&A. So I will stop here and thank you very much for your attention. Thanks.
So I don't even know where to start, but I'm going to say a few things. Let's go for that. I guess I'm going to start off on kind of a personal note, and then I'm going to go to kind of a big picture inspiration for me, and then I'm going to end by talking about some of the other things that I've been working on lately and how deep time figures into them. And then we'll kind of see what comes next. I think for me, thinking about somewhat longer time scales, for me this is really rooted in just what my parents did with me, which was we took a lot of road trips. My parents are kind of peculiar characters, and my mom became a big minor league baseball fan one year, precipitously. She was raised a Red Sox fan, but since we lived in Colorado, we didn't. They're original Rockies season ticket holders, but I'm old enough that this predated the Rockies, and so to get her baseball fix, minor league was the way to go. So one year, she bought a car from a friend in Vermont, and then we drove back from Vermont and hit about 20 minor league baseball parks along the way. Another year, we road tripped with the Denver Zephyrs, Denver's AAA team, to exciting spots like Omaha, Wichita, and Oklahoma City. And we did a lot of Western road trips as well. Did the national park thing, and I think the combination. My dad's a quaternary geomorphologist, which means that he studies, the shaping of the surface of the Earth within what for geologists is such recent time that his degrees are actually in geography. He studied in Britain and in Canada, And so the kind of geology that he does isn't even recognized as geology in most parts of the world because it only unfurls on timescales of thousands, tens of thousands of years. All of his work is really on the last 18,000 years. And then my mom was a historical geographer by training. She had a master's in that. And so between the two of them, we would drive around, and they kind of trained me to see the landscape as a combination of it's sort of a product of at least those two time scales. My dad, like most geomorphologists, was also aware of and understood the significance of more deeply rooted, longer running structural events. And so, I was kind of raised to see every landscape as a kind of product of a long set of stories, some of which some of which humans were the central characters in, some of which didn't really involve humans at all of which had this kind of combination of human, other than human interactions. And so I think that meant that when I finally, so I'll stop there. Now in terms of how I became a historian, I'll give you the short version there, and I promise maybe these things will connect eventually. So when I was growing up, I was interested in all sorts of things. History was one of them, and I actually did History Day, National History Day. And I entered repeatedly and failed miserably. And one year I made it to the state competition. And actually at that point, Patty Limerick, who some of you know, she was the state coordinator for Colorado History Day at that point. And so I'm in this, and you have to imagine, like I was 12 or 13. I was a middle schooler, so that's important for understanding just how mortifying this story is. So I was in the essay competition, and I'd written something on the Battle of Agincourt, I think, in 1415, between the English and the French, basically. That's what I remember about the Battle of Agincourt. But I think I'm right about that, at least. Longbows, yeah, exactly. It was the story of brave archers, yeah, and an English victory because my father's British. So, and so so I'm in this auditorium, and people think that thing of like giving trophies to kids for everything they do, that's a new thing. I was raised with that. So, they were going through the superlatives. I don't know if they still do it, but there's like everybody gets a certificate that has some superlative on it, and it's this sort of like rising crescendo of superlatives. And so, they've gone from like good to great to fabulous to, superlative might have honestly been one of the categories. And then they got to the people who won places. And so they said third place, and they hadn't called me. And so when they said somebody else's name for second place, I started standing up. I'm 13. I'm in what to me felt like a very crowded room. There was probably 80 people in it, but it felt bigger than the keynote today. And I started standing up, and then Patty reads somebody else's name, and I felt humiliated. And so I guess that is why I became a historian, to undo some childhood humiliation.
Great origin story. I like that.
Yeah. So this is a really bad reason to become a historian. To just kind of have that big a chip on your shoulder. But I was carrying on, and so as an undergraduate, I was still mostly interested in sort of late medieval, early modern European history. I did a lot of economic history, in particular. And through a series of events, I suddenly discovered that the American West had a history and that it was really, really interesting. And so this actually happened when I took a semester off. I was an undergrad at Yale, and I wanted to get the hell away from there. I wanted to save my parents some money. And so I did an internship on the Yankton Sioux Reservation in South Dakota. And I got there, and I was the only Wasichu living in the little mission town of Marty, and I was the only Wasichu working for the tribal government. And I really quickly realized that I had no idea where I was, I had no idea what was going on. And I was enough of a historian to know that reading some history would help me understand. And that's when I started becoming a Western historian. At that point, this was 93. At this point, environmental history was really coming into its own. And so I started reading some environmental historians, and for me that was really transformative. Because when I read environmental history, first of all, I saw a connection to that basic set of questions that my parents had taught me to care about. How did landscapes come to be the way they are? But more importantly, this is what I'm moving toward here. What I realized was that in environmental history, I had found a field where the sort of overarching mindset, the overarching set of questions, for me was really about that core ecological principle that everything's connected. And it was really as simple as that. I looked at environmental history and I thought, well, I like history, I like geology, I kind of like everything in some way or other. And so this is a field that then enables me to figure out how all these elements that you're sort of brought up to think of as isolated or to think of as separate ways of slicing up the world actually intersect with each other and inform each other and help to create each other. I think that thinking about longer time spans and thinking about human environment interactions, that's why I got into this. That's always been what I've been passionate about. It's led in all sorts of interesting directions. I wouldn't say that it's a particularly easy route to go. I've had to learn all sorts of new things, and I keep having to do that. And that's another thing that I love about that kind of approach. About kind of thinking about longer time scales, is it keeps you on your toes. And it means that I'm always sort of dabbling in new things. And I guess, why don't I say a few things about some of the other stuff I've been working on. You heard a lot about horses and flu, so I'm not going to say anything else about that. But the sort of the bigger project that I was working on, that I, as I confessed in the Q&A, that I've kind of despaired over whether I can ever finish it. I was trying to figure out, what I was really trying to look at was how humans related to other than human animals across a pretty broad span of North American history. And I have only gotten to the point of looking at several case studies effectively, or several kind of slices of that. But let me just kind of talk about one that I think people usually find interesting. You may not. So you can try to see if there's something else that's more down your alley, and when we get to questions. But I've actually done a lot of work on what I was thinking would be the first chapter, and that was on dogs and indigenous peoples prior to European contact. And so, this is actually a really, to me, it's a really interesting set of stories, because the basic issue, for me, the springboard is that whenever you read about animals and domestication and deep history, something here, guns, germs, and steel would be kind of a case in point. But even in works that historians find less fault with, there's a real tendency for the word only to precede the word, for dogs to be associated with the status as the only domesticated animal throughout indigenous American societies. There's some exceptions. So you can think of pigs in Hawaii, turkeys in the Southwest. You can quibble about what domestication means and how to define it, but it is basically true that the dogs are the certainly the most pervasive domesticated species, and for most indigenous societies, the only domesticated species on the eve of European contact. And so, I've been trying to figure out how to kind of tell that story and how to figure out why it matters, because again, sort of like the way I set up in the keynote, that's always a story of absence. Saying that dogs are the only domesticated animal is always part of an argument that involves casting native peoples as usually as either primitive or as unsullied by domestication and kind of all the sins that have flowed from it. So I wanted to sort of get beyond that dismissal of dogs as the only, by looking at actual interactions between native peoples and dogs. And so, what's the evidence for that? What are the sort of bodies of sources? There's a whole variety of things, it turns out. So part of this gets into the really deep history of canine domestication, which is probably an old world story. This is probably something that happens in Eurasia, dogs probably come over with native peoples. Then there's the question of what are native peoples using dogs to do, and so I try to kind of cast dogs and humans as a dynamic duo, so that whenever we think of like the ecological effects of Native American inhabitation of the Americas, particularly North America, dogs are virtually always part of that story, and I think that they matter more than people have usually managed to see. From there, there's the issue of what are Native peoples doing with dogs? What are dogs good for in indigenous societies? What do these dogs even look like? How do they behave? Are they dogs as we know them? And so, taking that kind of long run perspective has led me to, a somewhat tentative conclusion that indigenous American dogs, although they were, very much genetic cousins to Old World dogs, also differed from them in some important respects. In particular, I'm really struck, if you're familiar with early contact accounts, both Spaniards and English folks, I don't think I've found any instances of French people using war dogs, but both the English and Spanish would use war dogs, right? And it's well known that Native peoples responded to these animals being unleashed on them with horror and with considerable confusion. And this is interesting because these are people who actually have spent their entire lives with dogs. People to whom dogs are just parts of everyday life. So for me, the war dogs are in a different category from horses, for instance, right, which not a lot of people had not previously encountered. So why did the war dogs strike them as so terrifying? I mean, of course, it's because of how the dogs are behaving, but this behavior is completely unfamiliar. Native peoples never used dogs for warfare, and then the more I dug into it, I'm reasonably convinced this is a tougher case to make, but I think that they actually almost never used them for hunting in terms of actually killing animals. Dogs, I don't think, ordinarily perform the coup de grace in the way that all sorts of European and Asian and African breeds did. Again, this is kind of a tough case to prove, but I think that these dogs were actually somewhat different. When you look at accounts of how these dogs sounded, there's a lot of curious mentions and exploration accounts of dogs that don't bark, and I can't figure out to what extent that's a sort of element of canine, physiology or evolution. To what extent that's a consequence of Native peoples not constraining dogs, not coercing dogs. Are dogs not barking because they're essentially not territorial because they have the run of the place wherever they are? So these are some examples then, and that's just on kind of the material level. I actually also try to get into the kind of the very ambiguous place of dogs in indigenous thought and in indigenous religion, which is actually pretty similar to the ambiguous place of dogs in most cultures, right? Where there's sort of some of them are revered, but there's also this kind of sense of dogs as polluting for various reasons. And then in doing this, then this involves everything from reading genetic studies, focusing on early domestication, to looking at archaeozoological research, people who look at dog bones and use dog bones to make inferences about the burdens that dogs are bearing, because this is one of the major jobs they're doing. They're actually carrying pretty heavy loads across many indigenous societies. It entails looking at ethnography, looking at oral histories, trying to get a sense of sort of what stories and what conceptions are out there in indigenous produced literatures. And so that's kind of a rambling survey of what is a very long chapter in a book that may never appear in print. But I think it gives you a sense of what I, kind of how I envision longer term views on the past. They involve trying to look at different kinds of sources, trying to bring them together, and in particular, bring them together to put them in conversation with each other. Yeah?
Did your thoughts also, say, cover those that are not domesticated but interact and live with us? Deer and rats and mice and the whole intersection of human interaction and how that may have affected their change or evolution? integration with us?
Well, I mean, you know, in the animals book, the parts that I've worked on for the most part really mostly on domestication. In Coyote Valley, there I do a fair amount with wolves and beavers, and elk in particular. And so, you know, that gets more into those issues. I mean, on that elk front, for instance, you know, I try to track how youth hunting primarily not only limited elk numbers and kept them under control in Rocky Mountain National Park, which is now, you know, overrun with elk. It's gotten better in the last couple of years, but it was at pretty insane levels there for many decades. The elk populations. Native hunting not only controlled elk populations, but also changed elk behavior, probably. You know, and so the sort of where elk would be, how long they felt comfortable eating, all of those things really were affected by the creation of a national park where hunting was banned. You know, so that's it. So for understanding kind of like the contemporary problems of elk management, I think it's useful to understand that, like, well, this isn't the only way elk can behave, and that their really large impact on certain areas of vegetation is actually tied up with Indian removal in the park. So, you know, that's one example of that kind of story. Yeah. Other questions for me or David? Do you want to?
Well, let's. I'm going to try to at least address. Is Yvette? Yvette didn't come in. So, thanks, Thomas. We had envisioned the third panelist, Yvette Tuell, talking about native connections to understanding the past and the deep history. And she was going to talk about the nature of the connections between native peoples and place, and how that changes. Relationships about oral traditions, generations of use, the kind of acquired wisdom of being in a place and understanding the resources that are there, and then the spiritual aspects of that, how those the way they imagined the world created that world in place. The other part she was going to talk about is then how those traditions, that long history and that deep connection, gives Indians particular authority over, over public lands issues today. Bears Ears is a classic example of that, but there are a lot of every tribe has this issue going on. The use of public lands that were tribal lands, that were taken by the federal government. And then the way that deep tradition and native understanding should inform that use. In some places, that use is regulated by tribal environmental organizations or regulations. In other places, it's a battle with the federal government over the use of those resources. So that's kind of those were the intents of what she was going to say, and I can't speak to exactly what else she was going to do. So, do you guys want to come up and? Yes.
May I make a mention of a project that the Northwestern Shoshone tribe has been involved with? I work as their tribal library consultant, and we've received funding from the Utah Humanities to do a place name study of Aboriginal Shoshone territories.
Right.
And our first intent was to go and gather extant, lingering oral history knowledge from elders about place names, but found that we were a generation or two too late. So we've gathered up all of the extant names and then taken them to Shoshone speakers and elders and had them translate them, which is very interesting when you're looking at deep time.
Right.
The previous grant that we worked on, the previous project, was to take a list of Nua names, Shoshone, prior to white contact, and have these elders, Shoshone speakers, translate those names, which gives you a view into art and the view and so on. So that's interesting when you can mine the depths of the knowledge found in language and then infer to the past. That's about the best that we could do with our efforts recently. There is a very interesting connection coming forth that, for instance, Shoshone place names are not, they don't use humans to name places after. It's usually land features or historical events, something that happened there.
Yvette has just shown up, and I did damage to what you were probably going to talk about. Would you like to come up and talk about the way you approach deep history and know that? Here, we'll just hook you up to the microphone. You can sit or you can stand, whatever you're comfortable with. I gave you a great introduction, so they all know who you are.
Okay, I want to apologize for being late. I drove in from Idaho and I did not realize there was so much construction and there was a lot of cops out. So I couldn't go as fast as I wanted to go. I want to thank you all for allowing me to come down and speak. Was a bit of a challenging topic, pretty broad title. So I tried to figure out, well, what would be appropriate, considering that there's a variety of topics that have been discussed here. So I have some notes to kind of help me out here. So understanding that this panel is particularly tied to the land, that is something that's really intriguing, because and I hope you introduce me and everyone knows where I'm from. I'm Shoshone-Bannock tribal member, come from Fort Hall, Idaho, and one of the most intriguing things about this topic I thought was how the land is so important to people, specifically to tribal people. And when I first got into the study of history, my goal was to bring the people back onto the land. I had been working at the tribes in the Fish and Wildlife Department, and they had these great pictures of landscape, of rivers, of mountains, they're really focused on bringing back the resources. But when I looked at it, I said, where are the people? Where are the people at? And they kind of looked at me, and they're all biologists, they all count fish and whatnot. And I was like, you have a lot of animals there, you've got land, but where are the people? And they kind of just shrugged that off and said, people there. But that's where my interest was. And so from what I was taught, we called our lands Rasoul. It's our big lands, meaning that it goes endless, is how it was described to me. And we've always had that connection to the land. Even when we pray, first thing we thank is for the land, for the resources, for what has been provided to us here, for the water, for all the animals, the plants. That's the first thing we pray for. And we thank the Creator for allowing us to occupy this place. And it's our responsibility to take care of it. It's who we are. And so my interest is more on the geopolitical side, the extent of the land and how we exerted our own decisions and our own use of the land, how we coexisted on and within the land. And my interest was more on the historical side. And knowing that we have, particularly public lands, we as Shoshone-Bannock, we have extensive authorization treaty rights, which is applicable to public lands. And so in my previous job, I really worked on the treaty rights application. And we always had this broad statement of Shoshone-Bannock tribes have always exercised our authorization treaty rights. And I thought, gosh, what a broad statement. What does that mean? What does that mean to exercise our treaty rights? And it always came down to three things: hunting, fishing, gathering. And I'm like, gosh, we're pretty boring people. And that's all we're doing in the exercise of our treaty rights. Where's our people? And everything that we described when we talked to federal agencies was regarding, well, we hunted, we fished. And I was like, God, where's the people? Where's the stories? Where are we actually doing something on the land? So my interest became, I want to put the people back on. I want to hear the stories of the individual families, where they came from. And the way I looked at it was more of trying to reverse the old policy of Indian removal. I want to put the people back on the land. I want to put their stories back on the land, and not this generic treaty rights layer, because I felt like so boring. I mean, it just, where was the activities? Where was the laughter? And so when I started going into the history part, everything was male, and everything was boring, because it was based on more of the discussions between the political discussions. And who talked politics? Men. So when I started going back and looking at the historical references, I realized, gosh, for one thing, they didn't hardly talk about women, and they didn't talk about anything funny. So I'm like, gosh, they're so boring. It just kind of kept coming back to, where's the livelihood? Where is the people? Where is the life? And so yeah, that kind of led me back to the history and trying to better understand what is the stories of our people. And then it kind of turned into more of a political discussion. And so now that I work for my tribe as a policy analyst, I work extensively with our leadership, and we work on a variety of really important stuff. I find myself really asserting sovereignty, jurisdiction, exercise of treaty rights. And as I look forward in dealing with the issues that we deal with today and how we're trying to preserve those issues for the future, I thought, what about historically? How did we exercise our tribal sovereignty in the past? You know, everyone kind of goes to 1932, 34, 36, IRA, tribes officially became a tribe. Our leadership changed, but I was like, what about before? And then everyone kind of stops, goes backwards a little more to the treaty. Boy, the treaty is such a huge milestone, but it's almost the barrier in that you get a lot of the anthropological stuff about, we're hunters and gatherers, Shoshone-Bannock people, we didn't really have no political organization because we were running around being bored looking for food. So I thought, well, how did we have our sovereignty prior to the treaty? how can we look backwards and try to identify where was our economics, where was our military, where was our security, what was the social relations, how did we as Indian people exert our diplomacy, who did we have diplomacy with, and how do we look at that in terms of fur trappers, how do we look at that in terms of the overland travelers? You know, how can we understand how our people reacted to them? And it truly became an interesting discussion in terms of sovereignty. You know, and I see it today. I see that diplomacy exerted at so many different people between our Shoshone-Bannock tribes and all these different entities. We have the state, we have the federal government. Now we have local communications. And more recently, we're having a lot of intertribal diplomacy occurring. And so it's really intriguing to see and understand how did we go backwards in time for sovereignty. So that's kind of where, and I don't really have enough time to go into a lot of the research that I've done, but it's interesting because, for instance, today we have the conflicts, no, maybe that's the wrong word. We have engagements with other tribes, and I have to be real cautious on kind of putting the fingers at folks, but we do have contemporary controversies in terms of resources, subsistence resources, bison, Montana. Maybe not a lot of people know, but there is a huge controversy between tribes on harvesting bison that's coming out of the Yellowstone and going into Montana in this real small 1 mile area that I believe it is now 9 tribes come in and hunt in this small little tiny narrow little kind of like a field. Got houses right there, and so we have controversies on how, one, tribes exert their treaty rights, and two, how are tribes exerting their treaty rights that they haven't done in 100 years. So we're seeing some really heated debates within the tribes. Really interesting, and I think this is a great paper, but it's hard to write it because it's so active. It's going every year. Now we got the Crows want to come in. Now we got the Northern Arapahoes wanted to come in, and so even more and more tribes coming in and fighting over these few buffalo. And so there's that. And more recently, we're working on the Herrera case, the impacts of the Herrera case, the Supreme Court case that was heard this year. A great case for us because it affirmed our treaty rights, that it survived statehood in Wyoming. There are some additional unanswered questions when it comes to unoccupied lands in Wyoming, but it's a great decision for us. But now we have 2 other tribes, because there's only 3 tribes that have that unique Article 4 language, and that's Shoshone-Bannock, Eastern Shoshone, and the Crows. So now we're like, okay, Wyoming is wide open to us. How do we logically start exercising our right there? And you know, the ongoing discussions are just barely starting with the state. How do we collaborate with the 3 tribes to make sure that we don't have a future Herrera case is a huge point of discussion right now. And those are the discussions that are occurring. Hopefully we'll come to some sort of resolution in the next month or so. So you may be hearing something coming out. But we have very different perspectives of off-reservation treaty rights. Where does it apply over the land? And who has jurisdiction and who has the ability to exert their permitting? And so it's when it comes back to diplomacy, political sovereignty, it's not done yet. We're still exerting ourselves. It's a little more complicated because we've got these states, we've got these, I guess, different national forests who can't even decide if they're occupied or not. And the different opinions everywhere. It's kind of like how do we find that sense of coalition so that we can preserve our treaty rights and yet be able to live and be good neighbors and be a part of the state of Wyoming, the local communities, and yet be able to preserve our treaty right, which is 150 years old now. So, we're very excited. We got this positive decision, but we have some real discussions that have to occur here. It's exciting. I have to say it's really exciting, and then I think where we have two tribes, Eastern Shoshone and the Crows, they're not used to it. So they're kind of like the Columbia River tribes who are coming back to hunt bison. 100 years, they've forgotten how to hunt the bison. They've forgotten how to kill it. They've forgotten how to dress it. They've forgotten the bison's own internal social process for saying goodbye to one of theirs that are gone. So it's really interesting. And at some point I'll be able to come back and be able to say I finished my paper. But that was kind of one of the main things I wanted to talk about, as well as the family histories. And I think that ties right along in with this whole idea of where are we exercising our treaty rights and who was the people that lived there. And again, going back to that big generic treaty rights, public land, that's us. And so I'm like, no, we didn't, our people just didn't have a continual migration route. It's like, wow, they have no sense of home because they're always traveling. They don't. We have our neighborhoods. We have our people who like to stay in a particular area. So those are the things I'd like to start to really help put those people back to where they came from. And I think that's one of the exciting, the challenging parts, because we're seeing a lot of younger people who don't know. And why don't they know? Because of technology. My grandson, he's little 7 years old. He loves Minecraft. I have no idea what Minecraft is. I have no idea. He tells me all about it. He's like, last night he was trying to tell me, Grandma, here's how you play. Like, what are you doing? Why don't they have details? They're squares. I don't know what it is, and I don't know what they're trying to do, but there's zombies and there's but the concern that I have is that we're not teaching our younger people. We're not teaching it because we have to compete with technology. He complains, and I'm going to pick on him just because he's right there. When we go in the mountains, he gets mad. He has no service. And I'm like, dude, put your thing away. And he's just, I'm so bored. I don't have service. I mean, this is what we've kind of come. The reality is, we as people who are interested in history, we have to compete with technology. And it's, sorry to say, it's not just the 7-year-olds. It's the 20-year-olds. It's the 40-year-olds. We got grandmas and grandpas now having Facebook accounts. And they're all, who's saying what? And I'm like, you're here in Camas Prairie. Why aren't you paying attention to where we're at? And remembering what's important about here when you're looking at Facebook. So the reality is this is technology. How do we make it intriguing and interesting to our people? Because technology is so fast. If we don't try to figure out how to catch up in terms of teaching our own history, our traditions, our language, how are we going to survive in 50 years? But I think that's where I challenge tribal people in terms of you got to reach out and start documenting. I hate to say that, but that's the reality. And maybe we need to start accepting the technology and start combining that. I don't know, but so those are the two main things that I wanted to bring out in terms of Indian people, our perspective, and the land. And this is where, again, we come back to how we look at Rasoul, how we reaffirm it, how we use it, how we know it. This is important for us as Indian people, and I guess the challenge is for us to do it. And I think my big thing is we need to document. We need to teach our own. We need to teach our own people, and then we can share it with the world. But first, we have to know it ourselves, and so that's the challenge. So, short and sweet.
Thank you. Just a second. We've only got a few minutes left, so I'm just going to turn it over to you. If there are questions for our panelists, responses.
I think that that there's an interesting question about methods and sources, and when you do the long view and you approach it from, say, geology or approach it from environmental history, science is there, and science allows you to ask particular questions and look for particular answers that play into that type of methodology. But doing what Yvette's talking about, I think is far more difficult because of the loss of cultural memory, and it becomes down to then what types of methods can you employ to capture that social, cultural history, and preserving those memories. I mean, we know oral history, we know some other aspects of that, but I think I think maybe that's why when we see this long durée, and we pick Rodell and all these others, that a lot of science came into play there because it was the empirical way. I'm not trying to disparage, saying the easier way to do it, but it gives you that ability, but at the same time it also does what I think Yvette's suggesting, it erases people from that picture. Often the landscape is there, people are another factor changing it, but the stories of people are far more difficult to recover and to add into these long histories.
Just a short comment. One of the things that I have been working, and it's very difficult, in terms of science. In terms of science, do I need a microphone, please? Yes, sure. You're absolutely right. Science has become so empirical that it has removed humans from the picture. But if we can combine these two, I think there will be a new revolution in our understanding. In what sense? For example, when we study the history of the Earth, we think that it has absolutely nothing to do with us. We cannot learn anything from it because, well, it's nature, long time ago, etc. But let me give you an example how this can change. For example, when we look at the mass extinctions, right? There have been several. For example, Permian-Triassic boundary extinction. 95% of all life forms vanished. Then KT boundary, Cretaceous-Tertiary boundary, 65 million years ago. 2/3 of all life forms vanished, including the dinosaurs. So we study it and we get all the data. But then what we forget is that just after the extinction, actually our planet somehow nurtured more life. So life even flourished, especially after the extinction. Now, what were the mechanisms? Geologists don't understand it. They don't want even to study it because it has something to do with ethics. It has something to do with wisdom. You see what I mean? So, if we can somehow combine what the indigenous people understood their land, that relationship, with the modern science, it will help both of us in the sense that they can get the empirical, science and methods, etc., to come up with more concrete data about history, but also and society, but also scientists can offer a new worldview in which Earth or nature is not disconnected from our people, from history. And that's a major challenge. And we need both sides, both this indigenous wisdom and also modern science. I will give it to
you. Other questions? Or let me jump in and ask. We're almost out of time, but of the sessions you saw, how many of them engaged deeply in doing or talking about deep history in the conference? Majority? Little of both. So let me ask. We're taking deep history for granted as a good thing. What are the downsides of taking a long view of history or of deep history? Are there downsides?
Not coming back.
What's that?
Not returning.
I guess I would argue that it erases the specific. I mean, as you get to, though the types of stories of people on the land then can be homogenized and can be just part of a trend. It's kind of history from 30,000 feet. And it's not saying that one is better than the other, but it's like the difference between the local history. All history does happen locally, but when larger projects take local examples, they generally look at them simply as a case study, not for what's intrinsic about that place. And I think in Native history, you have to be very careful about that because tribes are very place-based peoples. And I think of things like Keith Basso's book about wisdom sits in places, about mapping and those kinds of things. The place matters. That specific instance matters. It's where history is as a repository for that people's history, not an archive. So I think that you have to be careful of that. You don't want to. There's room for both sides.
I mean, I also think that Coyote Valley in a lot of ways is a critique of big history, but it uses deep history to do it. I mean, what I was really trying to do there was, in a lot of ways, was to say, like, if you pick a particularly small place and look at it over a long stretch of time, it doesn't match kind of the big picture story. In that case, the Kawanichi Valley is kind of this bizarro west where you have sort of all the usual things, but it plays out differently. And so I think that, I agree with you that there's a really big danger when the history is both big and deep, when the scale is large and the time scale is large, you're missing all sorts of stuff. Which is a different issue, right? Than sort of indigenous place-basedness and what gets obscured there. But it means that a lot of the sort of big picture stories that we tell don't actually work very well for understanding any particular stretch of the globe.
There's a whole lot more we could do, and we are out of time, so I'm supposed to send you on your way. Thank you very much for attending the conference, for attending this session. Enjoy this.